Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. My name is Joe, and I work for the not-for-profit social enterprise Opus Independence and Now Then magazine based here in Sheffield. So tonight's live stream is all about work and well-being. Now, whether we like it or not, work is undoubtedly something that helps define who we are. It dictates how we spend a large amount of our waking hours and contributes massively to our sense of self, as well as, of course, to our finances, our class, and ultimately our well-being. The nature of work is changing, and the COVID-19 pandemic has fundamentally increased the speed of that change in both what we do and how we work. This live stream is part of a series of 3 Now Then articles and 3 events focused on Sheffield's radical roots and ideas for positive social change. Tonight, we will look at how work has changed in Sheffield since the Industrial Revolution, with a conversation with Ed Mustill, followed by discussions about current worker-led campaigns for improving working practices with Will Stronge from Autonomy. And finally, we'll be exploring the concept of the Wellbeing Economy with Liz Zeidler from the Centre for Thriving Places. Now, I'm going to introduce our first guest now. And Ed, if you could turn your video and microphone on. Ed Mustill is a GMB trade union rep, activist in the Sheffield Healy Labour Party, and author of the Sheffield Workers Committee. Thank you very much for joining us, Ed, for tonight's live stream.
Thanks for having me.
That's all right. Now, Ed, we recently commissioned you to write an Now Then article looking at this exact subject, looking at the history of work in Sheffield, which is available for anyone to read on the Now Then magazine website, which is nowthenmagazine.com. Now, the beginning of your article, you talk about how Sheffield itself is, of course, very much defined as a city by the start of the Industrial Revolution and, of course, the more recent decline in manufacturing. I just thought, could you give us a short summary of the gist of the article and let us know a little bit about how you discovered Sheffield and work in the city has changed?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a familiar story, I think, to a lot of people, the sort of rise and decline of manufacturing from the kind of early 19th century and then the decline after the Second World War. The point of the article, well, part of the point of the article is to say that that's part of the story, but it's not the whole story. The working class in Sheffield has always been very heterogeneous, very diverse. The sort of dominant figure of the sort of male industrial worker certainly is a real figure, but doesn't necessarily represent the kind of diversity and the full history of the Sheffield working class. The period of kind of heavy steel industry in Sheffield only really lasted as a huge employer for a few decades. And of course, even during that time, there are all sorts of associated other industries around that and industries that continue to exist today. And of course, so does manufacturing, although it employs far fewer people, it still is an important part of the Sheffield economy. So it was kind of, I suppose, to take that kind of familiar sort of rise and fall of industry story and just kind of flesh it out a bit and talk about some other aspects as well.
Great, thanks. And what were the, I suppose that some of the sort of key take homes for you? Because obviously, there's been this broad transition from an industrial past looking, into what's referred to, I suppose, as more of a kind of knowledge economy. Structurally, what are some of the sort of big themes and big changes that have been going on over this last sort of few hundred years?
I mean, we've obviously seen the decline of sort of large manufacturing workplaces, although it's worth saying large workplaces still exist. They tend not to be in manufacturing. Like, I work in a hospital, we've got about 3,500 employees. The big workplaces that exist tend to be kind of public sector and largely kind of white collar workers. Manufacturing which started out largely in kind of small workshops with skilled workers, has almost kind of come full circle in the sense that a lot of manufacturing jobs now are in smaller factories that don't actually employ that many people. The difference is obviously the technology has absolutely transformed manufacturing work. So, and one of the things that I imagine Will and Liz will have opinions on as well later is the kind of, I don't think you can really regenerate a city now on the basis of creating loads of manufacturing jobs, because the nature of manufacturing is that it doesn't require very much human labor compared to what it required in the kind of even in the mid 20th century, when there was still close to 100,000 people working in the Sheffield steel industry.
And one of the things that's fairly well known in Sheffield in certain circles is that it's often referred to as the low pay capital of the UK. Why do you think this is?
I mean, that's a phrase that's come about as a result of the Resolution Foundation's report from, I think, 2017, which found that sort of hourly wages in Sheffield were considerably below the national average, about 10%. I think that's not a problem that's specific to Sheffield, obviously, but where you have any place that used to rely heavily on industrial jobs and now relies heavily on retail, distribution, service sector jobs, has suffered that kind of wage suppression. And that's because you've basically a large number of unionized jobs have been destroyed, and they've been replaced with a large number of non-unionized jobs. And we know, it's not rocket science that wages tend to be higher in unionized industries. But it's worth saying as well that like manufacturing jobs weren't all well paid, and certainly not to begin with. And they certainly weren't secure jobs to begin with. They were very shared a lot of elements of what we would now refer to as precarious jobs, irregular hours, being laid off due to sort of seasonal changes in demand and all the rest of it. So what made those jobs well paid and more secure was, by and large, was the action of the labour movement in fighting for better conditions. And what hasn't yet happened in a big way, although it is beginning to happen, is the same sort of fight in the kind of low wage industries that now exist.
Great, thanks, Ed. And just to say, for anyone watching the stream, either in the webinar or on across one of our social media channels, if you'd like to comment or ask a question, we will be holding a wider panel discussion at the end of this live stream. So we'll be getting to any questions or comments a little bit later on. You talked a little bit earlier as well, but in the article about this almost mythical representation of the working class in Sheffield, most famously being played by actors such as Sean Bean. And I just wanted to ask you, what is left out of this representation?
Yeah, I mean, as I say, it's not an entirely inaccurate representation, like the sort of figure that exists in popular culture, but it's by no means the full story. So, I mean, the first immediate obvious kind of forgotten worker, I suppose, is the woman worker, because there were many women working manufacturing. There was just, particularly in the 19th century, a very arbitrary distinction between sort of manual labor that it was deemed okay for women to do and manual labor that it wasn't deemed okay for women to do. So many women did work in parts of the cutlery trade, in laundries, in other workplaces, but it took the First World War and the Second World War to bring women into like the heavy steel industry in large numbers. On top of that, also, of course, the kind of social and economically reproductive labour that was largely done by women in the family, which allowed families to subsist on the single wage of the male industrial worker. So you can't take, even where the figure of the male industrial worker is accurate, that male industrial worker is relying on, you know, the wife in the traditional nuclear family who is doing the kind of reproductive labour in the sphere of the household. It's also tends to be in popular culture a very sort of ethnically monolithic sort of image of an entirely white workforce, which we know isn't the case. And again, you know, for large parts of history, it's broadly true that most of the industrial workforce was white, but it doesn't tell the whole story. Particularly in Sheffield, the story of like Yemeni, young Yemeni men that came over from the 1950s onwards, largely to work in the steel factories, is something that's kind of being rediscovered now. But even going way back into the 19th century, you had a lot of migrant workers. They weren't necessarily kind of foreign, but they were coming from other parts of England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland. And it made for a much more kind of heterogeneous working class than is sometimes kind of depicted on screen.
And I suppose thinking about Sheffield today, so, you know, obviously, you know, the legacy of Sheffield's industrial past is clear everywhere you look, from you know, the difference between housing stock in different areas of the city, from you know, road names. You know, it's very, very present, I think, in the city's consciousness. But I just thought, thinking specifically about, you know, the world of work, you know, what do you think is, you know, the legacy of sort of Sheffield's industrial past, and how is it still impacting the world of work today?
Well, one of the legacies of it is what's happened to the actual industrial sites, and there's a kind of historical sort of irony, I suppose, that, well, I mean, it's not an irony because it's at least partly deliberate, but the kind of hubs of the new economy are sort of built on the graves of the hubs of the old economy. You know, you've got Meadow Hall on the site of the old Hadfield Steelworks. You've got demolished coal mines across South Yorkshire, which are now home to huge distribution warehouses or kind of tech business parks, or even the advanced manufacturing centre, which does have like well-paid, good quality jobs, is still built on the site of the old colliery industry, which has been physically kind of demolished and removed from the landscape, you know. So one of the legacies, I think, is that process of deindustrialization goes hand in hand. It's not like a sort of historical accident or a coincidence. It goes hand in hand with how the current economy was created. The destruction of some industries and the rapid expansion of others is, you can't really consider one without considering the other.
Great, great. Thanks, Ed. Thanks so much for joining us this evening, Ed. We'll come back to you a little bit later with the wider discussion. So if you could turn your video and microphone off now, that would be great. Really happy to introduce our next guest for tonight's live stream. So Will Stronge is a co-director of Autonomy, an independent think tank focusing on issues relating to the future of work. He is the co-author with Helen Hester of the forthcoming book, Post-Work, What It Is, Why It Matters, and How We Get Here. Hi, Will, how are you doing?
Hey, Joe, I'm fine, thanks. I'm actually on holiday this week, so I feel extra relaxed.
Oh, that's great. Well, you've chosen a good week with it, with the pubs reopening and a little bit done. So congratulations on your foresight. Maybe that wasn't an accident. Now, Will, you know, Autonomy is at the forefront of you know, publishing articles and research, you know, looking at the current state work in the UK. And I just wondered if we could start with you giving us a bit of an overview of your work, as an organisation, as a think tank, and tell us a little bit about how you're trying to influence change at both a kind of a policy and an organisational level.
Yeah, so we as you say, we're a small independent think tank. We started about 3 years ago, which is actually when I met the Now Then gang. Our focus is on the future of work, so it's even though it's a tight focus, it's obviously that's quite a wide remit as well. Our premise is really that there are a number of crises which are either currently ongoing or are kind of down the line from us. So whether that's the degradation of work as we know it, which is something which Ed's excellent article kind of touches upon, whether it's aging populations and how that will affect the way we work, whether it's looking at the environmental crisis, how the way that we work and how much we produce and so on has environmental implications, increasingly urgent ones, as I'm sure we're all aware, and also technological change. So whether that's increased surveillance through technological devices in the workplace, whether that's speed up, whether that's technological unemployment, and so on. So all of these crises are kind of the premise for our organisation, and we produce research and policy around these themes. And obviously in the past year, it's all been about COVID. So we've managed to adapt to talk about how the COVID crisis, as well as the lockdown, is impacting different industries and so on. And so the kind of stuff that we I guess our flagship policy has been the shorter working week, the 4-day week, as one of our one of the kind of policy that we've done a lot of research around, particularly in the last year, whether that's in the public sector. What would a 4-day week be like in the public sector? How's a 4-day week impact on our electricity consumption? How would it impact electricity consumption? And we look at welfare reform. Obviously, as I'm sure most of us here know, universal credit and the current welfare system is basically incredibly outdated, very pernicious. And so looking at things like universal basic income is part of our remit as well. And also then beyond that, we also have a kind of an architect team who look at urban infrastructure. So what would the workplace of the future be like? How to make workplace of the future desirable, how to make them work focused, and so on. Now, I guess to your second question about how do we affect change, or how do we go about what's our strategy effectively, well, I guess our purpose is really to change the common sense around work, but because of these crises coming down the road, because of the nature of work today, which we don't think it's less than desirable, the purpose is to change the common sense. And that's actually a bit harder than changing economic policy in a way, because our common sense about work, we have a very deeply embedded work ethic, which is often quite toxic. Some myths, for example, that if you work hard you will be able to succeed, get to kind of really succeed in society. That's not necessarily true anymore, if it ever was. To change that content is really important, and how we go about doing that is proposing real alternatives. So to some extent there's a utopian aspect to our project, which is to say another world of work is possible, a world of less work, of better work, and so on. But we also engage with a number of actors. This is where strategy comes in. So we talk to politicians, we talk to trade unionists, we work with trade unions, journalists, provide tools for activists, so people can actually have easily accessible, hopefully jargon-free tools and research which they can wield in their campaigns or in articles in different forms of the media. So for us, it's about having those kind of ideas and lying on the ground, for which people can pick up and really and take on from there, basically.
Great. And thinking, I suppose, with a bit of an international perspective, how does the UK sort of compare with I suppose other countries across the world, specifically Europe, maybe the States, and in comparison to really thinking about this thinking around work and potentially sort of more progressive policies? How are we doing in comparison to sort of international picture?
I mean, it's a bit of a mixed bag, really. I mean, for example, we unlike the US, we do have, we take for granted that we have, on average, the full-time worker in this country normally has about 28 days holiday, and in Europe there's obviously a range of different statutory holiday limits, but in America obviously it's much less. So in that sense we're quite progressive, but that's basically it. Beyond that, most working conditions in the UK are compared pretty badly to the majority of global north countries. So we only have 8 bank holidays, national holidays, which is equal with the lowest in most counts, basically. Finland, for example, has like 16 or 18, I think. Spain has 14, for example. We have 8, so we have low national holiday limits there. We have we have like a precarious labour market which is run wild. So in many countries, forms of regulation trying to keep up with the bogus self-employment, which again Ed talks about in his article a little bit, which touches on. So we have a really low wage, precarious, growing, increasingly precarious labour market, which the US also has, but nonetheless, it's one of these low wage, low productivity economies where good jobs are increasingly short supply, and it's all kind of propped up also by a general rentier economy of effectively property ownership, and rent being an increasingly more profitable way of getting on in life. Sorry, being someone who rents, being a rentier, is, extracting rent, whether you're a big data platform or you're a landlord and so on. That's actually more. That's basically a more economically efficient way of going about life than working. So it's a pretty dire state of affairs, and that's not to mention the fact that our working hours are amongst the highest in Europe as well. So it's a real kind of race to the bottom at the moment.
So I was thinking about, what do you think are the most then sort of critical campaigns at the moment, looking specifically at workers and working conditions? Obviously, you mentioned there the 4-day working week and UBI as potential solutions. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so when I was thinking about this question the other day, I was thinking, well, obviously there are a whole load of campaigns which are really important. So the general trade union activity at the moment is really important. So whether it's trying to stop firing and rehiring in certain sectors, or whether it's like basically campaigning for the rights for, the last year it's been campaigning for the correct equipment and so on. I think the ones I'd like to pick out are, yes, the 4-day week campaigns is one which Autonomy, it's a campaign which Autonomy works very closely with. They're really kind of going from strength to strength. And I think it's really important that as when we come out of this crisis, if we do, and when we do, that we don't fall into the trap of thinking that we can't have nice things, as they say, the trap of austerity, basically saying that actually when we come out of this crisis, we need to everyone needs to tighten their belts, and ultimately we need to go back to a very, very austere way of living because we've had it so good during this furlough period. That's something we really need to avoid. We need to learn from the mistakes in 2008. So the 4-day week campaign, putting new ways of working on the agenda in a crisis moment, is really, really important and has been effective in the past. One of the key moments of working time reduction in this country was after World War II, World War I as well. But after World War II, there's a nice kind of cliff edge of working hours, which then never, even though wages were then increasing from that point, working hours never really did. So we've got to make sure that this crisis is used for that. Equally so with UBI. So obviously, during the COVID crisis, we've seen how universal credit's not fit for purpose. We've had millions more people falling into using universal credit. It's clearly not fit for purpose. That's why the basic income conversation and the UBI lab network are so important, because you need to have these ideas and buy-in from around the country lying on the ground. So that campaign is particularly important. And then I guess I'd also point to Excluded UK, who I think are doing a great job of raising the concern of basically, I don't know how many million it is, I can't remember the exact number now, of those who weren't eligible for COVID support from the government, but have fallen through those cracks, and highlighting that is essential, because that's the kind of stuff that the news cycle churns. These people are in need, those people in need, etc. But without this group, that particular constituency, apart from a few articles here and there, would basically would have just not been on national agendas, and that's also why basic income is so important, so no one can fall through the net.
Great, thanks, Will. I just want to ask you another question that's looking about potentially other campaigns as well that are going at the moment. One thing that I've been aware of recently is looking at campaigns about how organisations and companies, essentially, the governance, how they're managed and how they're owned, essentially. And I just wondered really what you thought about these campaigns for change that looks at giving workers direct voting rights and stakes in organisations they work for, and potentially shares of the profits. And also there are other structures that are being mooted at the moment that are looking at sort of public common partnerships where even local authorities might have some ownership of local companies as well. And I just wanted to ask you about these campaigns really, and how you saw them, and whether you thought they were likely to increase this momentum towards change.
Yeah, I think it's it's very clear that changing the ownership structures of all sorts of different organizations, and giving more democratic say to those who work in them, and as to the direction of the company, and also where the profits go, who gets remunerated. We obviously have a kind of share buybacks kind of shareholder economy now, which clearly hasn't worked for many decades. So I think changing the kind of mechanics of ownership is fundamental to changing all those nice things within work, working time, kind of the social benefits of your job and so on. It's really essential, and it's a really important lever. So I fully agree with that. And I think when it comes to things like inclusive ownership funds, or like democratic governance, or just ownership, I think while necessary, I think it's important to remember that it perhaps isn't sufficient to kind of thinking through or actualizing let's say the world of work that we want. So I think it's absolutely necessary, but it needs to come with that. We need to think really about like the kind of shop floor mechanics. How do we work? What kind of things are we producing, and so on. There are other questions as well, but 100%. Changing ownership is really, really important. I say that the reason why I give that caveat is there are other places, like for example in Germany, sometimes they have that. I think you can't quote me on this, but effectively there are workers on boards. I think there is I don't know if it's actually in law, but it's common practice that there are workers on boards of large companies. But that doesn't necessarily mean that company much better things, or workers are having a much better deal. Often having workers on boards can be a strategy to kind of quell radicalism. So I guess it's important to think it's not quite a silver bullet just to say that if there are a few workers represented on a board of a company, because we need to think about exactly what change do we want, and then those representatives need to be held to account in a way.
Great, thanks, Will. And just one last question, I suppose, which speaks to what you said at the beginning, that obviously looking at the effect the COVID-19 pandemic has had on this space more broadly. And I suppose the COVID-19 pandemic has speeded up a lot of pre-existing pressures and forces for change, both looking at things like remote working and home working, and all of those related pressures. I just wondered if you could maybe give us a little bit of a view on where you see this sort of playing out in the future, and whether you think this will broadly be a positive change, or might be resulting in, you talked about a further race to the bottom earlier.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think it's something which we think about a lot at Autonomy. I think the genie's out of the bottle, as it were, when it comes to remote work. I don't think they'll, we talk to businesses of all kinds. I forgot to mention, we also run a consultancy service that pilots shorter working weeks in companies. Those companies who are afraid of moving to shorter working time, they want someone to kind of come in and run a trial. So when we talk to large, medium and small companies, almost all of them now, in fact, anyone who mentions remote work in these discussions says they're not fully going back to the office. So I think remote work is the new normal. Maybe not entirely. Everyone's talking about a hybrid model, and I think with that, as always, that future will be a positive one if certain rules and regulations are in place in your workplace. So do you have a right to disconnect? Is it clear that you can't be contacted at all hours just because your office is in your home, for example? We've seen actually that in general about between a half an hour or an hour has been added to most people who are working remotely. About half hour or an hour has been added to their working week, or day, I think. I can't remember exactly, but ultimately we're working more during this COVID period if you are working remotely. So that's something to really be wary of, to not just be a constant on call just because you're working from your living room. I think there was a lot of talk at the start of the COVID pandemic about revaluing work. And by that I mean revaluing different jobs. So we're thinking about those essential workers as key workers. That was a very positive development, that actually there was a categorization of that kind of work which is absolutely essential. All those who work in advertising or PR was suddenly like, actually you guys aren't essential. And that's kind of it. That's a very interesting, I think, quite positive development. of course, at the same time, a year later, the NHS workers are not getting the pay rise that they deserve, for example. It shows that actually we can very easily fall back into old habits. So that pressure needs to be, continued. That continued pressure from trade unions and campaign groups and journalists and policy organisations like Autonomy need to make sure that the new normal is actually something genuinely new in those senses. Because I remember there's been a number of polls at the start, beginning of the crisis, to show that the majority of the population don't want to go back to that really to the economy as it was before, because it was precisely not delivering for millions of people. So I think there's going to be more remote work. I think there's still going to be a hard push, particularly on this current government, to make sure that our essential workers are, core reproductive functions such as nursing and doctors and teaching and so on, get remunerated. And I hope I hope that does happen. But it'll always be a struggle. That's why the answer is always going to be caveated with, it can be positive, it can be negative. It's always going to be the balance of forces pushing each one, basically.
Great, thanks very much for that, Will. We'll come back to you in a little bit for the wider panel discussion. So thank you very much for your contributions just then. Next up, very pleased to introduce Liz. Liz Zeidler is the co-founder and chief executive of the Centre for Thriving Places, a charity and social enterprise helping to build a wellbeing economy across the UK and beyond. Welcome, Liz. Thank you very much for joining us.
Lovely to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
No problem. Just to start off with, the concept of the wellbeing economy. I think most people are very familiar with the term wellbeing and economy, but they might not necessarily know exactly what that kind of phrase means with those two words sat next to each other. So can you tell us a little bit about what the wellbeing economy is, and I suppose how do we get there?
Oh, those are two whopping big questions. Okay, so the wellbeing economy approach, which is growing really rapidly in all sorts of parts of the world and in all sorts of different sectors, is really about how can we develop an economy where people and planet really matter, that they are front and centre in all of our activities. Our current economic model puts as its kind of measure of success, its kind of end goal, if you like, the thing that it's driving towards and getting all of us in its wake to drive towards, is growth per se. So growth as an end goal. So we need to be growing this nominal figure of GDP to demonstrate that we're prospering and that we're successful. And actually all that's really, there's lots of nuance around this, but essentially what that's saying is we need to be consuming more stuff this year than we did last year and more stuff next year than we did this year. And the idea that just consuming and producing more stuff is somehow a success factor is increasingly bonkers. It really is properly bonkers, but it's absolutely still the driving factor in our economy. And the trouble with that as an end goal is it then skews everything else. So, healthcare becomes all about, cost savings, and education becomes about, helping kids to be ready for particular productive jobs, etc. And things like, our care industries and our cultural industries, etc., are just places to cut. They're not actually seen as a value in themselves in that sense, unless they're creating that kind of GDP growth paradigm. It's interesting that I think in that article you were referring to earlier, there's a reference to Kate Raworth, and she has a great quote where she says, we have an economy that grows whether or not we thrive, and we need an economy where we thrive whether or not it grows. So a wellbeing economy is about saying, okay, what's it all for? What's the economy for? What's work for? What's all of it for? Government, business, what is it all for? It's to help us all to thrive in an equitable and sustainable way. And that should be the end goal. And therefore everything else should line up to be delivering to that goal. And that comparatively seemingly small shift has this huge ripple effect on how we deliver our services, what we do about salaries, how we collaborate around work, it just sort of ripples into, I could be talking about work today, but we could be talking about how we organise education, or how we organise, health, how we organise our parks, and how we design cities. All of those things are affected by what we see as the end goal, or what we see as success as a collective, as a nation, as an organisation, as an individual, So it has that kind of ripple effect through all those levels. But yeah, a wellbeing economy is about making sure people and planet are front and centre in our decision making at every level of our increasing busyness.
And so I guess unpacking that a little bit about what you're talking about exploring really what work is for, I think, and the function of work, because I think you're right in the sense that perhaps there's this assumption that work is there to essentially just create additional amounts of material value for an extractive manager who can then take that value and turn it further into profit. So if work isn't for that, what is work for?
I think fundamentally we all know the answer to that question. It's a really important question. I'm not dissing the question, it's a great question, but we fundamentally know that work should be much more than that. We've I think Will was mentioning, our mindset has sort of taken in these assumptions over generations now, and we live them, and we live them in a we feel really strongly about them. But what if people talk about the 4-day week and say, but we can't afford that? Well, we can afford it. We absolutely can afford it. I run a very small organisation with no significant profits at all. We shifted to a 4-day week. We can do it depending on what we're seeing as our success factors. And I think the kind of capitalist model that we have all been living by for a very long time now tells us that success is that growing of the economy, and that it constantly tells us that we are benefiting from that. But actually, largely what we see, our grandparents' generation thought that mechanisation and all these fancy gadgets they were seeing emerging, etc., would mean we all had loads of free time. That was always the dream. We'd all have loads of free time. Everything, both home working and factory working, etc., would be so easy. We would all only be working 2 or 3 days a week. Of course, that hasn't happened, and that hasn't happened not because of any of those fundamental reasons, but because what's happened is that the money that all of that productivity has created just keeps getting taken off again and taken off again. So we've seen spiraling inequality. The rich have got richer and richer and richer because the whole system is designed not to help us to thrive, not to give us more time to spend with our families or in our wider lives, but actually to just create more and more wealth for fewer and fewer people. And we are certainly seeing that at the moment. Absolutely mind-boggling numbers of quantitative percentages of our global economy is going to, as we know, mostly, half a dozen rich white men. Sorry, I didn't mean men in a gender-specific way, in a whole panel of men. But it's reality.
You're very rightfully to put that message forward. Just opening up another question is just, what are some of the ways that work affects our well-being?
Loads of ways. You mentioned, of course, that we spend huge amounts of our time in work, but it isn't just about the time, which is important, of course. Let's fundamentally say unemployment is really bad for people's well-being. So, we mustn't diminish the importance of work here. So work itself is really important, but, we have an alternative to GDP at a local level called the Thriving Places Index, which measures all of the different conditions at a local level right across the country. All the data's there about a whole range of different conditions that really help us to thrive in that way that I mentioned in terms of the wellbeing economy. And one of those sets of data is about good jobs. So it's not just about unemployment, which is important, it's in that index, but good jobs are much more about some of the sorts of things that both Ed and Will mentioned earlier. Having some of that security. Having insecurity is incredibly bad for our well-being. Not knowing day to day, week to week, whether we can, have a roof over our heads, we can feed our kids, all that kind of stuff is incredibly bad for us. So security is really important. Of course, a reasonable wage, and people talk about the living wage, and it's really important, the living wage, but we've also got to think beyond that. Actually, what does a living wage really mean? And is it really a living wage, or is it a living, a coping wage? And I think increasingly it's been looking like that. Things like purpose and worthwhile. We've just done some really interesting research recently about the importance of a sense of worthwhile, and what kinds of industries and what kinds of work give us that sense of purpose in our life? Do we think what we do has any meaning, is providing any value to society? And that has a really big effect on our own personal well-being and our own sense of value and worth. So our value isn't just about what we get in our pay packets, but it's actually about, are we contributing? And that also is part of that kind of connection, you know, feeling connected, feeling like you belong both to your community but also to your organisation, and feeling perhaps that your organisation in an ideal world also feels a sense of belonging to its community. All of those things add to the sort of work that really grows well-being. And the opposite of those, of course, which both Ed and Will mentioned about precarious work and all of the different kind of race to the bottom things that Will was mentioning, you know, they're all exactly the things that undermine well-being, which ironically also really undermines, you know, the stuff that the current economic system values, like productivity and, you know, longevity and work and all those kinds of stuff. Those sorts of things that do have a very simple price tag on them are all undermined by poor well-being. We lose billions of pounds in our economy because of mental health, stress, you know, lack of all of those things I just mentioned. So work and well-being are deeply connected, but the moment we design work just for this very, very simple growth aim, if we designed work for well-being of people, place and planet, we would design work that was productive to the world and to society and gave us all those goods that we want, the things we need for our lives to be good, but would also value us as the producers of that in a very, very different way.
So, you know, using a similar question that I ended the conversation with Will previously, thinking about the COVID-19 pandemic and its effect on this whole space and world of work. Do you think the COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated or perhaps delayed or even rerouted a journey that might be heading towards a well-being economy?
Another great question, and I don't have any crystal balls, but I do have hundreds of conversations about this sort of stuff. So I think I am a natural optimist, so I have to be careful I'm not just falling back onto that. But I actually do really think that this tragic, so the pandemic has been, and I wouldn't for a moment want to underestimate the horrific impact it's had on people's lives, at well-being and fortunes. And I know it's going to be a very, very difficult task to move ourselves beyond this, but I feel really strongly that actually it has been an extraordinary moment of national and global reflection. So individually and collectively, I think we've had an opportunity to think about what matters most when we're all scared of dying, perhaps much sooner than we thought, or we're scared of losing our loved ones, or scared of losing our communities and our everything we've always thought would just be there tomorrow. We just made the assumption this stuff would be there, and then it hasn't been. Losing all of that overnight in many cases has, I think, helped us really think about what matters. And a lot of the wellbeing economy talks about measuring and valuing what matters. Are we valuing the things that really matter to us? And I think this has really showed us what does really matter in terms of that kind of, you know, a sense of connection. You know, people have really, really missed other people, their community, that sense of belonging. They've really missed that most. When people ask what they missed most, they've missed that human connection. So how do we start valuing the ways that we design our societies and our communities and our places and our workplaces around creating more community, around supporting community? It's also really made visible a lot of the invisible, and mostly invisible because they're unvalued by the current economic system, things around the kind of caring economy. So all of those sorts of pieces of work that are either in the home or in the, you know, in those very really poorly paid services or voluntary work in the community, that the system as it currently stands has ignored because it's been really easy to ignore it. You know, we were talking earlier about the history of the fact that that's been the fundamental thing that's held up the whole economy, is this whole wealth of women in at home making it even possible for people to go out to work. All of those sorts of aspects of our economy that have been utterly ignored or undervalued have all come to the fore. They've all been the only thing that's kept us going, you know. And so that sense that what matters to us is clearer, individually and collectively, I think is really important. And I think it is having a shift. We're seeing as an organisation that supports places to make this shift, towns, cities, rural areas, local authorities, you know, funders, all sorts of people all coming and sort of going, we know we need to build back better. My God, has that phrase been overflogged? But we need to do that. But what the hell does better look like? Do we have to start from scratch to write down what better means if we really fundamentally want it to be different? And, you know, lots of the work we've been doing for the last 11 years is designing what better looks like. You know, should we be measuring? What should we be valuing? What should we be investing in? And then helping people to put that at the heart of every decision making, businesses, decisions, voluntary sector decisions, any of those decisions. Let's make those decisions based on the impact they're likely to have on the well-being of current and, for that matter, future generations, which is where, of course, the planet's well-being comes to the fore.
Great, thanks, Liz. And it was funny you sort of mentioned the Build Back Better term as well. I mean, we specifically sort of titled this event, you know, with the phrase of radical roots and how to bounce forward. And I think that there's that sense of, I think a lot of organisations were really united around using that term of Build Back Better, which in some ways has been politicised and adopted in certain situations it potentially shouldn't have gone. But I really feel that we're almost, you know, the conversation has moved beyond a sense of going backwards and more in the sense of sort of what's this new future, where are we heading, and where can we sort of galvanise you know, movements for change from. Which I think is a really nice place to bring everyone back in as well. So I'd just like to welcome Ed and Will back as well. If you could turn your videos back on. Thank you everyone for rejoining us. I'm just going to ask. I had one sort of pre-prepared question, and then if people want to post questions on the chat or on the Facebook live stream, we can come to those shortly as well. But I suppose this question, looking at all the, you know, different campaigns and movements that we've been talking about tonight in this live stream, is, are we tinkering around the edges? Is the whole model of what we consider work fundamentally broken? Is our entire economic system, you know, completely inefficient and a wrong way of organising society? Do we need to completely reimagine the way that, you know, society understands and values human efforts? And maybe let's start with Ed, as we heard from you last.
Yeah, I mean, in short, yes. I mean, I'm in favour of the abolition of wage labour. Ultimately, I think it's inherently exploitative, and you know, that sounds like a very well, it is a very radical position to have, but you've got to think in the whole span of human history that this kind of work hasn't really existed for that long. It's only existed for a few hundred years, really. I think the question that preoccupies me as a kind of labour movement activist is how do you get to that point, from the point of talking about the sort of bread and butter everyday issues that occupy sort of most of our political energy. And that is, I think we can apply that to most of what most of us have said tonight is how, because the political reality of our current situation is that we don't have a national government which is particularly amenable to people saying we want to radically transform the economy, or we want to do away with rentierism, because they're essentially propped up by rentier capital as a political party, you know. So for me, it's everything that we've talked about so far. Yeah, the big question for me, I think I wouldn't describe any of it as tinkering around the edges. I think a lot of these ideas are on their own terms quite significant, like the 4-day week and all the rest of it. But they will, in order to get them, will require social struggle, because we don't have at the moment people in power that are amenable to those ideas.
Okay, thanks, Ed. Will?
Yeah, I mean, I think systems change is, I mean, we're in a weird situation where, like, the idea of systems change is becoming increasingly common sense beyond, let's say, you know, beyond, let's say, fringe circles or just the left. You have these ideas encroaching in all sorts of other places, and we're in a situation where that is becoming a certain common sense, while at the same time leading governments around the world, including our own. I say leading because they've been dominant for the last, great number of generations, are basically almost dead against that idea. so I think it's at the same time, that is actually not, if you look at it in one way, that's not actually that's a sign of strength in a sense, because we have had, particularly during, let's say, the third way years and the new Labour years and so on, we had a very different common sense where actually the system can't change and tinkering is all we can do. And ultimately we can scrape some of the top off financialization and try and redistribute that into the minimum wage or into, a variety of other kind of nice, better pensions and so on. But that the fact that there wasn't a counter or a contrary common sense, that ultimately we need systems change, particularly now spurred on by the environmental movement, but also in general, just the degradation of everyday life and work. That's a really positive development if you think about it. So yeah, you can either take the question and let's talk about strategy, or if you're thinking about, do we need systems change? Yes, of course. I think I won't go on and on, but I think a strategy of decommodification is potentially one way to think about this. So if we start from thinking, whether we're going around the foundational economy or thinking about Mariana Mazzucato's work around state-led innovation, let's think about what things which perhaps we shouldn't leave to the private sector as a first step. That's like a tentative step away from, let's say, kind of vanilla social democratic reform towards something more radical. And so we're thinking about public utilities, transport, the necessities of everyday life, things like that. How do we decommodify them at the point of use so that people have an abundant access to these basic things? That is non-reformist, but nonetheless something which is quite obvious in a way. I think We Own It of a very good campaign you run on, think about public ownership, but also all that discussion around basic services is a really good one to have, because ultimately it's very doable, it's fairly cheap, and I think it's something which does shift the kind of fabric of everyday life. And that's when we also start talking about basic income as well. So those things I don't think are kind of game changers, as Ed was alluding to. They're not quite tinkering, but I think I feel like that's the only game in town, is basically starting to work within the parameters of current common sense, but pushing it into areas where you can't step back from. Just like the weekend was something which was ultimately won just after World War II, but in different industries by different trade unions. But ultimately, for the majority of people still, it's incredibly hard to take that back from them. Even though some people do work for 6 days a week, still 7 days a week, they're still a minority. The majority of full-time workers still have a weekend, and that's a staple which we can build on.
Great, thanks, Will. And Liz?
So I agree with a lot of what's already been said. I think for me, there's something around the word momentum that's quite important, and I don't mean that in a political way. I mean, as in, we need to build more momentum around this. I think that we are in a country where the national government's openness to this sort of much more radical agenda feels a long way off, let's put it like that. But actually, we're seeing momentum around the world. It took a new leader in New Zealand to suddenly say, right, we're doing a wellbeing budget. It isn't perfect, but they overnight went, right, this is, if you want money from this government, you have to demonstrate the positive impact you're going to have on wellbeing. That's going to be front and centre in all of our budgeting and all of our commissioning. That had a radical effect right through the system. And even much closer to home, things like the Future Generations Act in Wales, that was a bold political decision to put that through in the legislature, and it has had a ripple effect on all sorts of different things, different ways of people working in Wales, and we're seeing that all the time. And we're seeing, as an organisation, different sectors coming forward who are going to go, you only need one or two really far-sighted people who've got a little bit of decision-making power in a different business or an organisation or in local authorities, for instance. The reason we're called Centre for Thriving Places, not for Centre for Thriving Nations, is because we can build momentum in places. If a town decides to make decisions differently about how they're going to regenerate, if a city decides its planning decisions are going to be based on some really fundamentally different ways of working, these things do really open up opportunities. So I think the work now, if we want this much more radical way of being to come into existence, is to support the momentum builders to prove that it's possible in different industries, in different sectors, some tiny, some bigger. Let's not be fussy. Let's just get some momentum going. Let's show it's possible and start showing, it's Emperor's New Clothes stuff, start showing the old system for what it really is by demonstrating the extraordinary impact you can have, even in small ways, with a newer one.
Great, thanks, Les. I'm going to try and get a few of these questions. I'm just going to direct some of them at specific individuals, and then we'll get through a few of them. So first up, Ed, just for you from Julia, given what we said about hybrid and remote working, how might that change our union organising efforts?
Well, I think we're going to find out very, very shortly how it is. Short answer is I don't know. I mean, it's very tricky. I mean, I've been working from home most of the pandemic. I can't stand it, and I will actually rather go back in the office. But that's because I like my work life to not be anywhere near my home, and I know it's different for different people. But I think one of the things to remember is that certain elements of flexible working have actually been around for a long time. So I think there might be a shift in terms of the quantity of it, but from a union organising point of view, there are a lot of industries. Most industries are still going to require most people to be on site most of the time. And if you're organising in a workplace where shift work exists, you already have to have multiple meetings for people that are on different shifts and all the rest of it. So that it always has been a feature of union organising to do that sort of stuff. It always has been a feature of union organising to try and organise home workers, because home working itself means something very different now than it did 100 years ago. But actually, a lot of small scale manufacturing jobs were done by home workers in their own home in the 19th century. And those workers were organised, but it was very difficult. I think that the communications technology we have obviously makes it easier, but I think we'll find out in the next couple of years how different it's going to be and how sort of different we need to make our approaches. But I'm not too worried about it, because I think most workforces will still be site-based.
Thanks, Ed. I'll go on to another question now as well, but if any of the other panelists want to refer to that one as well, you're very welcome to. And this one just from Mark Wrigley, I'll probably address this a bit to you, Well. Thinking about, he said, I think we need to look at technologies that could deliver some of the goals of well-being in work. And I suppose, obviously there's already most people working at home, and lots of people setting up their own businesses on internet platforms. And I suppose in a way that, there's obviously the negative side of that as well, which ties into this sense of, a lot of freelancers or artists or people who work in that sphere talk about almost having to brand their own sort of personal identities within this space as well. I just wondered what you thought in reaction to that comment, Will.
I mean, yeah, I think the remote work thing is, what's really fascinating about it is that for years and years, every survey around remote work, either conducted by the TUC or others, at least a quarter of workers would say, those surveyed would say, for at least 1 day a week, I'd like to work from home, because you have 1 day away from, 1 day less commuting, 1 day, without someone looking over your shoulder to check your work, you can get about your work in your own way. And at the same time, it was never really realized on a mass scale. It was always just kind of one of these kind of demands, just like, which kind of falls by the wayside of slightly more important ones like higher wages and so on. Then we had this mass experiment of remote work, which, is actually, the dust is still settling on what that's meant. And for loads of people, there's a whole, section of people who absolutely loved it. And there's loads of people who, on the whole found that actually, it's invading my life, because, I'm kind of expected to be working the whole time. So I think I'm still fascinated by thinking through what our remote futures will be, and how that might change city landscapes and so on. And particularly if large companies are no longer going to be renting these spaces in the center, what does that do to prices and so on? I think I'm always wary of technologies in the workplace implemented without sorry, I'm rambling a bit here, but I guess there's always an argument to say that, yes, the management of technology in the workplace and machines in the workplace and so on, the management of that, for if negotiated between, let's say, those staff and management, trade unions and management, could be used, for example, to share out, those benefits, whether it's a shorter working week or and so on. But in the main, new technologies, if they're for example, monitoring when people are working and so on, these are just like devices for surveillance. So I'm slightly, we should always be wary, basically, of the idea that simply having new tech in the workplace will make our working lives better. So that's why it's important to just know exactly what these things do, and to what extent increasingly those who work with these new technologies know how they work. Basically, there's a huge issue of there being a black box of new technologies, particularly of software and so on, being used in workplaces, and knowing what data is being collected and so on. I think there should be a right for, and I think actually GDPR does account for this, but no one really knows about this in GDPR. Most people think GDPR is just about, can you send emails or not? But GDPR does, and this is really important as we're leaving the EU, does allow for workers to know what data is being collected on them, and also have it does stipulate that you can have the consent to not have an automated decision being made about you, for example. But most people don't know about that. So I think that's going to become increasingly important, those defenses against data being gathered about you.
Great, thanks, Will. And I'll address this one to Les, and then we might have time for just a couple of really quick fire ones at the end. Just from Rowan, who's thanking you all for an interesting chat, but also wanted to know where you see system. I'd like to know where you see the system change, I think, as a parlance, as a term, becoming common sense or more popular. I've said I'd like to see that was the case, but I don't really see where. Has capitalism really been significantly damaged by COVID, or might it even be strengthened for a while by it? Where are the cracks where the light might get in?
Great question. I don't have an answer that will suffice when we're 1 minute after 7 already, but I think it's a whopping one, isn't it? As I said earlier, I think there is light. There are cracks all over the place. I think there were quite a lot already. We've been going for 11 years now, and I've seen a remarkably different level of interest and action all over the world at lots of different levels, even places you really wouldn't expect it. I've spoken at in this radical conversation, fairly, you wouldn't say somewhere like the OECD was somewhere we should even be mentioning in this conversation. But I spoke there many years ago in a tiny back room about whether or not wellbeing should ever even be considered. And last time I spoke there, not last year because it was COVID year, the year before COVID, the Director General of the OECD, the ex-head of the World Bank, all these sorts of people, all saying we can obviously take that with a big pinch of salt, but all saying the future economy has to be based on the people and planet measures, not on GDP. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that's going to happen overnight, or I believe every word they said, but that's a radical departure for organisations like that, and we're seeing much more real examples in communities all over the country, in businesses all over the country, in cities all over the world. So things are changing already, and I think COVID, where that light is coming in, is accelerating that, because the public is starting to demand it, not just around COVID, but also about the climate crisis, also about Black Lives Matter. The sorts of big mass movements that we've seen in the last few years are all saying what's going on at the moment is not okay. Wherever we sit in those political spectrums, it's not okay to be treating people and the planet like this. And so I think there is change coming along. I think we do need to look at it collectively. There's some great questions here about what happens if you go to a 4-day week and you rely on overtime, etc. Because these things need to come as a system. They fit together. The quality, the amount we pay people, the amount we value different types of work means that we need to be sharing work out. There are people who are overworked and there are people who are deeply underworked. We need to share that out both in terms of time, but also in terms of money. So we can't just go, fine, you're now doing a 4-day week and you could forget the other 2 days pay. Of course, that's not how a 4-day week thinking works. It's really important that people don't think that's what it is, otherwise it will never take off. It isn't that. It's about, we have a certain amount of work that needs to be done. We have people who are skilled to do that. We need to make this a much, much better system so that we all have enough financial security, but we also have enough well-being. That's where the well-being piece comes in. Even it might seem a bit fluffy, it's actually really radically saying people's lives and the quality of those lives really matter. And that's financial, but it's also human and societal.
Great. Thanks, Les. And we'll just try and get 2 more very quick questions each in. So Will and Ed, if you try and keep responses fairly brief to these. Just quickly to you, Will. Is the 4-day relevant to low earners already relying on large amounts of overtime? How will the 4-day week affect people currently working 6, for example?
Okay, I'll be very, very quick. 4-day week's not a silver bullet for all issues at work. If you're working 6 days and you can in 6 days a week on low earnings in order to just survive, and that's also an issue of pay. The point of the 4-day week is to move the normal full-time working week at that pay down to reducing it to a 4-day week. It can be transitioned over a certain amount of time. If you do that, if you shift the common sense understanding of what a full-time working week is, then you also shift understandings of what part-time work is. You shift an understanding of what is what you're entitled to for a certain amount of hours put in. This is generally what the going rate is. So it'll be a game changer, which has like a number of other peripheral benefits. And so it doesn't obviously speak to those who are in certain other arrangements, but nonetheless, it's in the majority of people who do work 5-day weeks. If you shift that, then that's a non-reformist way of changing the way that we work in this country.
Great, Will, thanks. And to Ed, just this last question from Jeremy Shaw. How important are ownership models within capitalist society? John Lewis has a different model, staff are partners, but they're still closing the Sheffield store with over 300 jobs at stake. Still have to compete in a capitalist world.
Yeah, I'm glad someone mentioned that, because I was going to mention the John Lewis situation with its so-called partnership model. And I mean, a lot of these things, it's like the German companies that have had workers on board since 1945 and all the rest of it. The real, for me, the real issue is it's about power in the workplace, and the structure of a company can be very different, but they can still treat their workers like crap. It depends. And I think similarly for the kind of slogan of share out the work, which Liz mentioned, which I think is going to become incredibly important in the next few years. That again is an old labour movement demand, and there's been countless struggles over that over the last 200 years. But in order to do it, you need a very high level of workplace organisation. You need the unions and people in the unions to say, okay, we're going to ban overtime because that means that more work will be available to other people that need it, or whatever the issue is in a particular industry. But to actually get there, you need that level of organisation. And I think it's the same in any company, whatever the structure of the company. If ultimately management has all the power and the company is structured essentially like a dictatorship, like most companies under capitalism are, then you need the organised workers as a counterbalance to that power.
Great. Thanks, Ed. And yeah, I think that's all we've got time for this evening. So I'd just like to thank very much Liz Zeidler for joining us from Centre for Thriving Places, Will Stronge from Autonomy, and Ed Mustill as well. And please do read Ed's article on nowthenmagazine.com about the history of work in Sheffield. It's a great piece. Thank you very much for all watching and being with us this evening. We're going to be running another live stream on the 29th of April, looking at the local council elections here in Sheffield, and also the referendum on the new council governing structure on the strong leader model, or the committee model here in Sheffield. So please do join us again on the 29th of April. And that's it. A big thanks from us all here at Now Then Magazine. Thank you for joining us. Have a good evening. Cheers.